Hi, I'm Rachel with Rose Acres Farmly, and I just wanted to let you know from now on my crime videos, my true crime videos are going to go to Rachel Ray's Crime Corner, and I will link that in the description for you if you are coming from Rose Acres Farmly, because Rose Acres Farmly, I'm going to still be doing devotionals and things around the property and things like that, but I'm going to be doing my crime videos on Rachel Ray's Crime Corner from now on. So I am hoping that y'all go over there and subscribe, and so you can, if you're here for the crime videos. All right, so we're going to continue our school shooting series. Today we're going to be discussing the second school shooting that happened in America. It's my third video in this series because the first one wasn't really a shooting. It was just a school massacre. It was a school massacre. And if you want to see the first two videos, I will link them in the description. On November 3rd, 1851, William H.G. Butler married a lovely 21-year-old by the name of Elizabeth Peck. She was referred to as Lizzie. In the summer of 1852, Mr. Butler joined his brother, Noble Butler, at the Louisville High School. And around that same time, William and Lizzie welcomed a little bundle into their home, a baby girl whom they named Edith. They were just beginning their journey of life, love, happiness, and adventure. Just 2 years later, everything suddenly changed. On November the 3rd, 1853, the day of the couple's 2-year anniversary, Lizzie sat lovingly by her husband's side. The only anniversary gift she wanted was a miracle, because her husband was struggling to breathe. He had been savagely shot in the chest the day before. As she wept and prayed over the love of her life, she began to try to put the pieces of this tragic story together. For today's story, we're traveling to Louisville, Kentucky in November of 1853. The average temperature in Louisville in November is 40 to 57 degrees, and it's usually pretty dry and clear during the first part of the month. So Tuesday, November 1st, 1853, was probably a nice, crisp day. The day started out as a fairly ordinary school day for 14-year-old William Ward and his twin brother, Victor. William left the home of his wealthy father, Robert Ward Sr., and mother, Emily, after gathering some chestnuts. His parents and his 19-year-old brother, Robert Jr., had headed out of town about 100 miles away so that their son could visit with some friends in Cincinnati. As William approached the school, he began to catch up to his friends and engage in the typical good-natured teasing of school-age boys. Their teacher, Mr. William Butler, was a 28-year-old from Indiana who had previously been a tutor to William and his brothers for a little over a year before traveling through Europe to develop his language teaching skills. He returned in September of 1851, just before his wedding. As a young child, his right hand had been severely burned, causing him to lose the ability to close it or write with it. The day's lessons began and continued until a 5-minute recess was given. Ward began sharing the acquired refreshment with some of his classmates. After their daily French lesson, Butler noticed chestnut shells under a few desks and asked who had eaten them. Butler punished one student who had shells under his desk and admitted to eating during class. He did not punish a second student because he was new and didn't know the rule against eating. When Butler accused Ward of eating chestnuts in class, the young man admitted bringing them in, but said he had distributed them before class and had not eaten any during the class. Due to the fact the other boys in the class said Ward had been eating them, and there were shells under his desk, Butler accused him of being a liar and administered a whipping. Ward took his hat and left the school. That evening, his parents and Robert Jr. were still away, so he told his older brother Matthew what had happened. The following morning, November 2nd, Mr. and Mrs. Ward and Robert Jr. returned home around 9 a.m. They were surprised to see their son William at home instead of at school with his brother Victor. Matthew explained what had happened at school the prior day. and told his father that he was going to the school to seek an explanation and demand an apology from Mr. Butler. His father offered to go instead, but Matthew insisted on going since William was under his care during the incident. Matt Ward had gone out earlier that morning and bought a couple of loaded pistols. His mother, unaware of the pistol purchase, insisted that Robert Jr. accompany him. Robert Jr. was known to carry a Bowie knife due to a previous confrontation with another teacher. About 9:30 a.m., one of the Ward family's 9 servants arrived at the school to collect school books and escort the 4th Ward brother, Victor, home. Around 10 a.m., the other 3 brothers arrived at the school. Unaware of the anger of Matt Ward, Professor Butler greeted them in a friendly manner. Matt called him a scoundrel and a coward. Professor Butler tried to get Matt to go to another room, but he said he wanted to resolve the issue in the same room it had occurred. There was much debate as to whether Butler tried to hit Matt first, but one thing was certain, and that is Matt raised his hand to Mr. Butler as if to hit him, and then pulled out his pistol and shot him in the chest. Butler fell to the floor, and as he did, he said, "I've been killed, my poor wife and child." Robert took out his knife and waved it at the boys in the classroom. The brothers then left, but Robert returned briefly to retrieve the murder weapon. Students attempted to help Butler to his home, though he was so ill that they could not bring him that far. They were able to get him to a relative's house and call a doctor. Many doctors attended him through the afternoon and into the night. When one of the doctors was trying to remove the ball from the wound, they heard air come out of the cavity, and they knew it did not look well. Butler died early on the morning of November 3rd, 1853. After the shooting on that fateful school day, Matthew and Robert Jr. went home and informed their parents and Matt's wife Anna of the fatal confrontation they had with Professor Butler. The Marshal of Louisville, upon learning about the seriousness of Butler's wound, placed Matt and Robert under arrest and escorted them to the Jefferson County Jail. They remained there until a motion was made December 15, 1853, to have them moved so they could have a fair trial. They were moved to Elizabethtown in Hardin County on February 1st, 1854, without bail. The first day of the trial was April 18, 1854. The Wards had 18 attorneys, which included some pretty prestigious people. Robert Ward spared no expense in his effort to keep his sons from being found guilty for their crime. The indictment charged in the first count that Matt and Robert shot with malice aforethought, premeditation. This means they planned and intended to cause the death of William Butler. The second count charged Matt with the shooting and Robert with being an accessory. On the first day of the trial, Matt was suffering from the effects of rheumatism, and he walked in with a crutch. Matt and Robert's family were audibly grief-stricken at the sight of the two boys. Matt Ward's trial was first, and he pleaded not guilty to the charges brought against him. Mr. Wolfe, attorney for the defense, requested a list of the prosecution's witnesses. Mr. Allen, one of the prosecuting attorneys, said he wanted the same thing because he knew that the defense wanted to prohibit all witnesses from sitting in the court while another witness was testifying, and he wanted to be able to do the same thing. The judge ruled to have all major witnesses on both sides out of the courtroom during testimony. 13 of the high school boys who were present on the day of the shooting were introduced as witnesses for the prosecution. On the key issues of the happenings of the day in question, the students pretty much told the same story. Keep in mind, they were not allowed to be in the courtroom during one another's testimony. I wrote this summary of the day of the shooting by including anything that at least 3 of the students testified to. I also included parts of the narrative that may have only been retold by 1 or 2 witnesses because it helped the narrative flow without determining guilt or innocence. On the day prior to the shooting, William Ward, the youngest brother of Matt Ward, and a pupil in the high school had some chestnuts. During the class recitation, he and a classmate by the name of Al Fisher had a controversy about them. Professor Butler spoke to them about the disturbance and told them not to make so much noise. Notwithstanding the reproof, William continued to talk to Fisher about the trouble. Professor Butler spoke to them again, and after the class was through, he asked Al Fisher what they were talking about. Fisher told him it was in reference to some chestnuts, and he admitted that he had eaten some during school hours when he knew it was against the rules. Professor Butler gave him 5 or 6 licks on the legs with a leather strap. Fisher then told him that William Ward had also eaten some chestnuts at the same time, but when William was asked about it, he denied it. Several of the boys said they saw him eating the nuts, and the teacher then told William that he had evidently told a lie and that he would have to be whipped for it. And he then gave him the same number of licks with the strap that he had given Al Fisher. Shortly after the whipping, William Ward left the schoolroom and said he was going to tell Matt, and that Matt would give Butler a hard time. The next morning, at around 9 a.m., a slave of Mr. Ward called at the school building and left word for the books of the Wards to be sent home. About 10 o'clock, Matt, Robert, and William Ward came into the school together. William took a seat, and the other two remained standing. Matt inquired for Mr. Butler, and when he came in, Matt said to him, "I have a little matter to settle with you. Which is the most to blame, the little contemptible puppy who begged chestnuts and then lied about it, or the boy who let him have them?" Mr. Butler requested Ward to go into a private room and stated he would explain the affair to him. Mr. Ward said, "No, here is the place to answer the question." Mr. Butler refused to answer without making an explanation. Mr. Ward then said, "Why did you call my brother William a liar?" Mr. Butler said he was not disposed to answer the question without an explanation. Mr. Ward said, "You are a blank liar and a blank scoundrel." Ward then made a motion, as if to strike him. Butler moved back a short distance and then raised his right arm and moved towards Ward. Ward drew his hand from his pocket, presented a pistol to Butler's breast, and fired. Butler dropped immediately to the floor and exclaimed, "Oh, my wife and child, I'm dead." Matt then drew another pistol, and Robert Jr. drew a knife. Mr. Sturgis, the assistant teacher, came out of his recitation room, and Robert said, "Come on, I'm ready for you." Mr. Sturgis retreated to his room and jumped out of a window. During the controversy between them, Mr. Ward spoke loudly, and Mr. Butler softly. After the shooting, all the Wards left the schoolroom, and 5 to 6 of the students carried Mr. Butler to Colonel Harney's residence and sent for a doctor. Several doctors attended him, all of whom testified in the case. The boys were all consistent in saying they did not see Mr. Butler strike Ward. Some said he put his hand on Ward's shoulder, and a couple said he non-aggressively pushed him to the door. There was a man named Mr. Allen. Not the Mr. Allen that's the attorney for the prosecution. Another man also was with Mr. Allen, and both of these men said they had talked to some of the students at the gate of the schoolhouse on the day of the shooting and asked them what had happened. The two said that the boys they had spoken with informed them that Mr. Butler had struck Matt Ward. In the boys' testimony, the defense lawyers kept trying to bring this up and leading the witnesses, but only one of the boys was familiar with Mr. Allen, and he said he didn't see him nor talk to him on that day. One student remembered seeing a man talking to the boys, and another student remembered seeing 2 men speaking with the boys. Most of the other boys said they either did not go into the schoolyard after, or they testified explicitly that they never saw or talked to Mr. Allen or anyone else about the events of that day. 7 out of 13 said they didn't see Butler strike Ward, and not one boy ever said that Butler hit Ward. 6 of the boys said that Butler put his right hand on Ward's shoulder in a non-threatening way. The gunsmith, J.J. Gilmore, he said that Matt came to his store around 9 a.m. on November 2nd and wanted to look at a self-cocking pistol. He told Mr. Gilmore if he would load the pistol, he'd take it. He then asked how much a pair of self-cocking pistols would cost. He said if Mr. Gilmore would load both of them, he would buy the pair. Mr. Gilmore loaded them with powder and ball and put caps on them. He said he kept every variety of pistol and revolver, but these were the smallest bore he had, and the barrel was 3 inches long. Bore refers to the inside diameter of a gun's barrel, so this was the smallest that he had. The prosecution requested to examine Mrs. Butler, who was in feeble health. They asked that her friend, Mrs. Harney, accompany her. The ladies were brought in, and this caused a loud, compassionate reaction from those in attendance. Mrs. Harney said she saw Matt around 10 a.m. on the morning of the shooting. His appearance was unusual, and his gait was more firm and excited than usual. He had one hand in his pocket and the other to his side. She was sent for and informed that Mr. Butler was at her home. When she showed up, there were many people in her home. She went to Mr. Butler's side as he was lying on a rug in her parlor and attempted to calm him. She assured him he would recover and that he only had a flesh wound. He said he was definitely going to die and asked her to be kind to his wife and baby. He then asked her to bring his wife and baby to him. Lizzie Butler said that her husband told her he was going to die. She had been told that he would live, so she tried to assure him that he would be okay and that he should just keep quiet. But he still kept saying he was going to die. Dr. D.D. Thompson said, I saw Butler about 20 minutes after 10. I removed his coat, tore open his shirt, and found the wound in the upper left side of his chest. The surface all around was burnt. I asked what position he was in when he was shot. He said, Matt Ward called me a liar and struck me. I struck back and was immediately shot. I don't know who shot me. Soon after this conversation, D.D. Thompson said he heard the air splurge through the wound. Butler asked what it was, and he told him. Butler said, I'm a dead man. Another doctor named Dr. Yandell also attended Butler. He said they tried to probe the wound, but could not penetrate the cavity. He recalled Butler saying he and Matt were clinched. Ward had called him a liar and raised his hand to strike him. Then Butler struck and was immediately shot. He did not remember Butler saying he didn't know who had shot him. One of the next witnesses, Patrick Joyce, testified that Butler could not bend the middle joint of the fingers on his right hand, and he could not straighten any of the fingers on that hand. He said that Butler had considerable strength in his arms and was in the habit of exercising in the school gymnasium. Dr. Caldwell had arrived a little after Thompson and Yandell. He had asked Butler if he knew the position of his body when he was shot. He said he didn't see who shot him because he and Matt were engaged. He suggested they raise Butler's arm to try and get the probe to enter further, and so they could reach the cavity. The next witness was a character witness by the name of Reverend E.W. Sehon. He was a minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Louisville. In case you're like me, you're wondering what the Methodist Episcopal Church is. It was the oldest and largest Methodist denomination in the United States from its founding in 1784 until 1939. It was also the first religious denomination in the U.S. to organize itself on a national basis. Reverend Sehon said he had known Matt for 8 years and that he knew him to be amiable and peaceful. He testified that Matt's health at the time of this sad occurrence was very feeble. He had been using crutches. He had just laid them aside when this happened. Quote, his disease was rheumatism, and having suffered from that myself, I often brought remedies. End quote. He spoke of Matt's travels to Europe, his books, how often he had heard Matt being spoken of highly. He testified that he was not familiar with Mr. William Butler, but he was highly acquainted with his brother Noble Butler and considered him to be a worthy friend. Many other witnesses testified to the fine character of Matt Ward and didn't fail to bring up how feeble and unhealthy he was. One of the character witnesses testified to how amiable Matt was, but mentioned that Matt was quick to resent an injury. He said that Matt seemed to seek out the company of ladies as opposed to gentlemen. A Dr. Flint was called to the stand as a witness for the prosecution. He had been Mr. Butler's doctor for 10 years. He said that Butler had been burned as an infant, causing the deformity in his right hand. He had operated on Butler's hand, but it had not given him any relief. Butler couldn't open his hand wide or make a fist. He had checked on Butler on and off during the day of the shooting and had performed a post-mortem examination. The ball had entered between the third and fourth rib, passed through the lung, and was embedded in one of the vertebrae. Upon cross-examination, he said that Butler could almost close his hand and would have been able to strike with it, but he wasn't sure as to how hard. The defense resumed and called witnesses that testified to seeing Matt the day of the shooting. They had noticed slight redness on his cheek and around his eye, but some of them said that Matt had drawn their attention to it before they observed it. The defense then attempted to prove that it was common practice to carry pistols in Louisville. A witness for the defense, J.M. Barlow, stated that when he heard the commotion and discovered what had happened, he went to Mr. Harney's and talked to Butler. He said Butler told him about Ward coming in and wanting an apology. Quote, Butler said Matt called him a liar and that he hit Matt for it. Or as he was a learned man, I suppose he said struck him for it. And in the fuss, Ward threw his right hand against my breast and shot me. The pistol stuck in my coat and I pulled it out. End quote. Barlow approached Robert Ward Sr. and asked if they could use a witness that could show that Butler had struck Ward first. Robert Ward said that was exactly what they needed. He swore under oath that he had never been offered a cent from Mr. Ward for testifying and that he never expected to receive anything for it. Mr. Allen was called to the stand by the defense. He said he was from Mississippi, but was in Louisville at the Hydropathic Institute on the day of the shooting. Mr. Sturgis ran into the clinic and yelled for someone to run for a doctor because Butler had been shot and perhaps killed. He said he started for a doctor, but when he saw some boys were already headed to get a doctor, he went to the schoolhouse where he saw 12 to 15 boys. He recognized one of the boys as being Mr. Worthington's son. I'm going to interject here that William Worthington testified that he did know Mr. Allen, but did not see or talk to him on the day of the shooting. Mr. Allen recognized some of the other boys from seeing them in the gym, but didn't know their names. He said he questioned the boys as to what had happened. He said Worthington didn't speak, but nodded in agreement with the other boys who spoke at once, and said Ward came to the school and cursed Butler. Butler struck Matt, and Matt shot him. A man named Gudgel was with Allen, and he was called to the stand. He said 15 to 20 boys were in the yard, and that he had asked the boys what had happened. According to him, 5 or 6 of the boys said that Ward had come in demanding an explanation. Butler ordered him to leave, and when he would not leave, some of the boys said Butler had struck him, and some said that Butler pushed him down, and as he got up, he fired. According to Gudgel, all the boys he spoke with said Butler had struck first. I find that pretty amazing since not one of the boys that testified said that Butler struck first, or at all for that matter. If there were some students that had seen it differently than the 13 who had testified, then why didn't any of them testify for the defense? There was an objection to the testimony of Allen and Gudgel by the prosecution, but ultimately it was deemed admissible. There was a witness who testified that he had received Ann's music box. Ann is Matt's wife. He testified he had received Ann's music box for repairs. Prior to the day of the shooting, Matt had requested that he get the music box back by the following Monday because he and his wife were planning a trip to their plantation. There was an objection to the relevance of this testimony, but the defense said their goal was to prove that Matt was planning on a trip and therefore show he had no malicious intent. Some other store owners were witnesses to the fact that Matt and his wife had made several purchases the night before as they were going on a trip to their plantation in Arkansas. Anna's dad was the captain of the Belle Key, and he testified his daughter and son-in-law were planning to travel to Arkansas on his ship. Mr. Ward Sr. was called to the stand. He said he had arrived home the morning of the shooting at 9 a.m., and upon hearing of the prior day's punishment of his son William, he had sent a man to get Victor and William's school books. He had planned on going to the school to speak with Mr. Butler, but Matt insisted on going. He said his wife told Matt, "You are very feeble, and you know you've had difficulty with Mr. Sturgis, so you should take someone with you." Robert again made mention of the feeble nature of his son. He said that when Matt returned, he heard his wife Emily scream, and Matt saying, quote, "Would you have me be beaten like a dog?" End quote. That's when Robert said he noticed his son's red, swollen face. He then proceeded to testify that he had known Butler a long time, and he tutored his children for 20 months. He had no reason to believe there would be any trouble. Mrs. Emily Ward was then called as a witness. She spoke of her return home on the morning of November 2nd, and that she wondered why her son Willie wasn't at school and why he had a sad expression on his face. She learned of the whipping her son had received the day prior. She said that Willie had bought some chestnuts and placed them in his pocket. When he pulled out his handkerchief, some of the chestnuts fell out. Some of the boys asked for some, and he shared with them. They threw the shells behind his seat. When Mr. Butler noticed the shells, he asked the students whom they belonged to. They said Willie had given the chestnuts to them. There was a dispute between Willie and one of the boys as to whether Willie had shared the snack with them before or after class was called to order. Butler then whipped Willie for giving chestnuts and for lying. She said the thing that truly bothered Willie the most was that Butler had called him a liar. As Matt was headed out the door, she told him to remain calm and then urged Bob, Robert, to go with him and keep the two from getting excited. She reminded Matt that Mr. Sturgis was his enemy, and he replied, "Never mind that." When they returned, she noticed a mark on Matt's cheek and redness under his eye. Crittenden, one of the lawyers for the defense, asked her how she knew Sturgis was Matt's enemy. This was objected to, overruled, and the defense didn't pursue the matter any further. On the way back to her seat, Mrs. Ward fainted, which caused quite a bit of excitement. She was soon carried out of the courtroom. A Mr. and Mrs. Crenshaw both used testified to the story Barlow had told them about Butler striking Ward before he was shot. They had become familiar with Barlow when he became a boarder in their home. Mr. Crenshaw stated that Barlow heard Butler's version of the story while Butler was getting his coat removed. There were more character witnesses and some testimony as to whether or not it's customary for a gun seller to load a weapon for the customer. A couple of people said it was appropriate for a store clerk to load the gun for a customer so they could learn how to load it. Another witness found it odd for a store clerk to load the weapon, and some other witnesses said they didn't really know what the custom was. The defense then tried to call Robert Jr. as a witness. This was highly objected to by the prosecution. They argued that if his testimony helped to acquit Matt, that it would in turn acquit him as an accomplice. After much debate and with strong persuasion on the part of Crittenden, Robert Jr. was allowed to be called as a witness. Robert Ward Jr. began discussing events that had occurred the morning of the shooting. This is his version of that day. Upon their arrival back home, he was taking care of household chores. At one point, he headed to his mom's room when he saw Matt and his mom standing in the doorway. Matt told him to go get his coat. When they got to the gate, Matt said he was going to ask for an apology from Mr. Butler. William said, "Butler is a stouter man than you, and Sturgis has a big stick." Matt said he didn't think there would be any difficulty because Butler was a gentleman. Robert said Matt told him not to interfere unless Butler and Sturgis both attacked him at once. He said they talked about different subjects as they went along. Along the way, they met Lucy Stone in a bloomer costume, and Matt spoke of it. On entering the schoolroom, Matt asked for Butler. When Butler came in, Matt said, "I wish to talk with you." Butler urged him to come into his private room. Matt said, "No, here is the place." Mr. Butler nodded. Matt said, "What are your ideas of justice? Which is worse, the boy who begs chestnuts, throws the shells on the floor, and lies about it, or my brother who gave them to him?" I love the way Robert edits that comment because 13 boys pretty much agreed on the contemptible puppy that lies about chestnuts. But Robert says, "What are your ideas of justice? Which is worse, the boy who begs chestnuts, throws the shells on the floor, and lies about it, or my brother who gave them to him?" Mr. Butler said he would not be interrogated, putting his pencil in his pocket and buttoning up his coat. Matt repeated the question. Butler said, "There's no such boy here." Matt said, "That settles the matter. You called my brother a liar. For that I must have an apology." Butler said he had no apology to make. Matt said, "Is your mind made up?" Butler said it was. Matt said, "You must hear my opinion of you. You are a blank scoundrel and coward." Robert said Butler then struck Matt twice and pushed him back against the door. Matt drew his pistol and fired. Butler held his hand on him for a moment. As the pistol fired, Sturgis came into the room. Robert drew his knife and told Sturgis to stand back. The three wards went out to the gate. Robert started to say something his brother William said, but he was stopped by Mr. Carpenter, attorney for the prosecution. He was then cross-examined. He said he drew his knife when Sturgis came in, but that he did not go up the aisle in the schoolroom and that he didn't gesture toward the boys with the knife. As they entered the schoolhouse, Matt's hands were by his side, and after entering, he held his hat in his left hand, gesticulating with his right. He said they didn't shut the door as they went in. According to Robert, Butler's manner was rather stiff, not as cordial as usual. Butler might have struck more than twice. Matt did not put his hand in his pocket till Butler seized him. Robert said he had carried weapons since he was 14 years old, sometimes pistols, sometimes a knife. And finally, it was time for the prosecution to present their testimony. George Sullivan was called. He said he had spoken with Barlow on the day of the shooting. He said he heard Barlow say if Matt Ward wasn't punished for this, it was no use trying a rich man's son in Kentucky. He proposed to go take Matt out of jail and hang him. But he could have just been jesting. After he went to Robert Ward Sr.'s for a visit, Barlow's story changed. Ward had invited him into the parlor, and Barlow asked if it would be beneficial to the case if there was a man who could prove that Butler hit Ward first. Ward said, "Absolutely." Barlow said, "I'm that man." Ward was ecstatic and shook Mr. Barlow to pieces from his excitement. He said he wanted to call his family down to introduce them to him. Sullivan said that Barlow then stated he told Ward he was a poor man and couldn't afford to miss work to attend the trial. Ward then told him he would be paid tenfold. Another witness was called who had heard Barlow talk about his meeting with Robert Ward Sr., and his retelling was pretty much the same as Sullivan's. Most importantly, he remembered Barlow mentioning he would be paid tenfold for testifying that Butler had struck Matt first. Dr. Thompson said he could not remember Barlow being at Mr. Harney's home on the day of the shooting. The schoolboys had helped him remove Butler's coat. No one else did. If Barlow had done it, he would remember that. He said he doesn't let someone interfere with a patient in his care without knowing who they are. Dr. Thompson said he never heard Butler say he struck Ward first. He did say Ward came to the school, called him a liar, and struck him. Then Butler hit him back. The defense then called some witnesses on the behalf of Barlow's character and honesty, and over 25 more character witnesses for Matt Ward. Robert Sr. was called again to verify Barlow's account of the meeting they had. Robert Sr. said the only payment he had offered was for Barlow's wages for the day. Finally, testimony on both sides was closed, and the lawyers began to make their final statements. 3 for defense, and 3 for prosecution made final speeches. I'm going to read to you some of the statements made by the lawyers that stood out to me. The prosecution. It's a fearful thing to violate the law and become subject to its penalties. Yet, if by false sympathy you neglect your duty, you violate your oaths, you not only subject yourselves to the penalty of human laws, but you fall into the hands of the living God. Life is short and vanishes away, and we shall soon be laid in the cold, quiet grave. When you approach that time and your heart remembers what it most wishes to forget, when the mind becomes clearer as it approaches the brightness of its Creator's presence, will it not be sweet to remember that in this case, when so much has been done to thwart your judgments, you yielded not, but discarding prejudice, fear, and favor, marched boldly forward in the line of duty. My duty is now done. Yours is yet to be discharged. The prosecution also brought out some interesting summations concerning the pistols. The pistols were stated to have been purchased in order to protect Ward and his wife as they journeyed to the South. This particular type of pistol was also stated to have been something young boys would play with, almost like a toy, because of how little power it had. The prosecution said those two things don't support each other. If you're going to purchase a gun to protect yourself, you're going to want something that is more powerful. Ward only purchased the ammunition that Gilmore loaded the weapons with. He did not purchase any more ammo. If the guns were for protection on his journey, he would have purchased much more ammo. This type of gun was meant to be used in close proximity to its intended target. The attorneys for the defense made some convincing statements. The speech that stood out to me the most was John Crittenden. He urged the jury to consider the speech of the prosecution referring to meeting their Creator. He says the law is full of mercy, and it's better for 10 guilty men to escape than for one innocent man to suffer. My task is nearly done. The fate of the prisoner is in your hands. It is for you to say whether the captive shall go free from his bonds or whether he shall be consigned to disgrace and death. What power under this bright sky is more like omnipotence than that which you possess, the power of life or death? Are you not awed with the majesty the law has conferred? You are not like marble statues, but are humane men, and as such will frame the verdict you must pronounce. The memory of a verdict consigning a man just commencing life with all the hopes and expectations of the prisoner, a verdict that shall cut all the cords that bind him to society and send him to an early grave, will often come up in your recollection and cannot be forgotten. And when that clamor that has filled the air for several months shall have died away, and you shall think you have dealt harshly with a brother's life, and you remember there was a doubt in your mind about the case, what a moment that will be. The thought will remain a cancer in your hearts. But should you acquit, and subsequent developments show that you ought not to have done so, the matter is easily fixed. The prisoner has not entirely escaped. He's left to heaven and the future. You can say, I did not take on my soul the task of pronouncing a verdict of guilty in a doubtful case. But if you find you ought to have dealt mercifully and did not, that thought will be the corroding cancer in your lives. Pronounce no such verdict, but on the most solid ground. Keep on the safe sides of your oaths, and on the safe ground of humanity. Have that sure and solid ground, and save yourselves, and save the prisoner from a dishonorable grave. It will not satisfy you in after years that your verdict was justified by some nice distinctions in law. You must believe this man is a murderer, not by some nice legal point, but by undoubted evidence that requires no argument. If you try to make out a case by picking up a scrap here and there, you are wrong at the start. You must have a case that decides itself. The moment you try to make out a case, my life and yours is in danger. When you have returned to your homes, then subtle distinctions will all have been forgotten. The man is hung, and you cannot tell why. If legal logic is to be the foundation of your verdict of guilty, give it up at once. The law makes you the shedders of blood. Have substantial, durable ground for your action. I have looked at this case calmly, have seen many things I wish were different. But I see no malicious motives, no murder, no felony. You are not to dispense with law, but I contend you cannot discharge your duties under the law without a verdict of acquittal. Life or death is in your hands, and as you pronounce, so must it be done. Finally, the judge spoke to the jury. He said, malice, express or implied, is an essential ingredient of this crime, and without it, there can be no murder. If you see it as a crime done in the heat of passion, without malice, that is manslaughter, and you will decide how long the prisoner will be confined, anywhere from 2 to 10 years. If you believe it was self-defense, then the law excuses it, and your duty is to find the prisoner not guilty. On Wednesday, April 26, 1854, at 5 p.m., the case was closed, and it was left to the jury to decide. On Thursday at 9 a.m., the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Matthew Ward was immediately discharged. A nolle prosequi, that means abandon the prosecution, was entered in the case of Robert Ward Jr. Comment down below whether you agree with that verdict or not. Many people did not agree with it. As the news of this verdict spread throughout the city, there was tremendous outrage for the lack of justice and embarrassment over the reputation of their city, with fear of becoming a mockery. To try to overcome the stain of this disgrace, a group met and made many decisions regarding ways to handle this miscarriage of justice. One thing they decided to do was erect a monument in the honor of William Butler and his grieving family. Next came the resolution to request the departure of Robert and Matthew Ward from the city. A resolution to ask Wolfe to resign his seat in the Senate and for John Crittenden to resign his place in the U.S. Senate was also decided. Those were both attorneys for the defense in Matt's case. Rough sculptures of Matt Ward, Barlow, known as the false witness, and members of the jury were hung up and burned. A crowd of angry men and boys surrounded the Ward's home and mansion and began launching rocks through the windows and destroying the outer glass wall of the conservatory. Once again, they strung up effigies, that's rough sculptures, of Matt and Robert in front of the door, and they set them on fire. Fire engines were called for, and they were able to extinguish the flames of the fire, but not the wrath of the city. There are many things about this case that are angering and contributed to at least one guilty man going free. One big factor was Crittenden. At first, Crittenden had refused to defend Matt Ward, and it took some convincing from Robert Ward before Crittenden finally decided to defend Matt. At the start of the trial, the Wards had an article put into the newspaper stating that Crittenden was volunteering to defend Matthew. Crittenden, in his closing statements, said he had volunteered to defend Matt. The message that was sent to the jury is that Crittenden was so convinced of the innocence of Matt that he was compelled to join the other 17 lawyers already hired by Robert Ward Sr. Another issue was lack of aggression on the part of the prosecution. There was a lot of testimony for the prosecution that was rejected by the defense team. The prosecution didn't fight back hard enough. Professor Sturgis, the man that kept being brought up by the defense as having an issue with Matt, had an interesting statement that was not allowed to be entered as evidence because the defense objected to it, and the prosecution did not insist upon it. The testimony was, however, solemnly sworn to. Sturgis said, In the spring of 1853, he had corrected William. He said he took him and boxed his jaws. He and Mr. Butler were called to the home of Mrs. Ward, and she was very upset at the story William had relayed to her. She demanded an answer as to why he had treated her son in such a manner. She then proceeded to say that if there were any more occasions to punish her children, that Mr. Butler should take care of it, because he was gentle and kind. She also hinted that they just might withdraw their sons from the school entirely, to which Mr. Butler responded it might save him the trouble of dismissing them in the future. Sturgis said that once he gave his account of what had happened, Mrs. Ward had calmed down and expressed regret for the violent language she had used. She treated him with the utmost courtesy throughout the rest of the interview. During the latter part of the interview, Mrs. Ward requested that they let her know if the boys misbehaved or neglected their studies in the future, and she would correct them. The teachers informed her that some offenses must be dealt with right away, and she made no objection to this. Matt Ward came home while they were still there, and Mr. Butler introduced Sturgis to Matt. Matt said that when he had heard about what Sturgis had done to his brother, he had intended to inflict personal violence. Since Sturgis was an older man than Matt had thought, he would not have resorted to violence. Sturgis said that he himself had left no threatening message with Mrs. Ward. After leaving, Butler and Sturgis agreed to dismiss the boys at the first sign of misconduct from then on. Butler had explained to him the day before the murder that it was the strange circumstances that led him to do otherwise. There were 5 students that testified, and part or all of their testimony was objected to by the defense. All 5 testified the whipping William had received that day was not severe at all. The other boy that had received a whipping that day was asked if it was severe. He said it was not, and that William's also was not severe. Other than that, I didn't really see anything in their testimony that would have been reason for the defense to object to it, but they did. The last statement that was not entered into evidence was of Professor Josiah Bliss. He was a teacher at Louisville Collegiate Institute. Several years prior to the shooting, William and Victor were students under Professor Bliss. He said one day he had to discipline William for telling a lie. On the following morning, a man came to the school with Robert, William, and Victor, and as he approached, he asked, "Are you Mr. Bliss?" The man then requested that he come to the door so he could speak with him. He left his students and walked to the door. He got an uneasy feeling as he saw the looks on Robert, William, and Victor's faces and felt like this must be one of their brothers. He stopped at the threshold of the door and questioned the man as to what he was wanting. The man said, "If you come outside, I'll let you know." He asked the man if his name was Ward, and he said it was. And he wanted to know why he had whipped his brother William the day before. Bliss told him if he would come into the classroom, he would settle the matter with him. Matt cursed him and called him a blank rascal and coward for not coming out. Believing he was armed, Bliss attempted to shut the door, which was hindered by a thrust of Matt's foot against it. After he succeeded in closing the door, he heard 2 to 3 kicks against it, as well as cursing. He watched as Ward walked away and saw him join another man who had been waiting at the gate to the entrance. So that is the story of Matt Ward, and I don't know, I believe he should have definitely at least been found guilty of manslaughter, but he was not. And now I want to go into some of the lives of the different players in this story. I found some of it quite interesting. So if you want to stick around for that, we'll go into it and you'll see what actually ended up happening to Matt and his brothers and some of his other family members. So let's get into that. Jonathan and his wife, Nancy Hopkins Butler, had 3 sons. Noble, born in 1810, Charles, born in 1820, and William, born October 3rd, 1825. They lived in Pennsylvania until 1817, when they moved to Jefferson County, Indiana, to raise their family. Soon after baby William was born, there was an accident and his right hand was burned. He was never able to make a right-handed fist. He could not bend or straighten the middle joint. He could only bend the joint closest to the hand. In 1846, at the age of 18, William graduated with distinction from Hanover College. He taught for a year in the lower part of Kentucky, and in 1847 he joined the faculty of the Louisville High School established by his brother Noble. In the fall of 1848, he became a private tutor for the younger Ward children and remained there until the summer of 1850. At that time, he sailed for Europe to perfect his already extensive knowledge and to attend a peace conference in Frankfurt. He returned to Louisville in September of 1851. Robert Ward offered him another tutorial position for his children, but William declined the offer and started a private school for boys. In November of 1851, he married Lizzie. In the late summer of 1852, he and Noble and another teacher reopened the Louisville High School. Robert Ward enrolled his twin boys, William and Victor, into the school. Butler's little baby Edith was born sometime during the summer or fall of 1852. Matt Ward's father, Robert Ward Sr., he was born on January the 8th, 1798. At the age of 20, he met and fell in love with a lovely 17-year-old girl named Miss Anne Holland Johnson. The two were married on June 27, 1819, in Scott County, Kentucky. Sadly, they were only married for a few short years when Anne passed away on March 27, 1823, at the young age of 21. The couple had no children. Robert Sr. began to experience political success, and at the age of 25 served as the Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. In 1825, Robert met and fell in love with Emily Flournoy, the daughter of Matthews Flournoy, who was a wealthy farmer and prominent politician from Fayette County. Robert lived in Louisville, but spent a lot of time in New Orleans because he had a cotton brokerage there. On May 19, 1826, Robert and 16-year-old Emily had their first child, Matthew Flournoy Ward. Their second child, Sally, was born in 1827, and Malvina Laura in 1829. In 1831, Robert Ward retired from politics and moved his family to Louisville, where he became quite prosperous. In 1836, around the time their fourth child, Robert Johnson Ward Jr., was born, Robert Sr. built a fine mansion for his family, and they would throw lavish parties for his political friends. They had four more children: William and Victor Ward, born in 1839, Emily Ward in 1841, and Eliza Longworth, referred to as Lily, in 1844. Matthew Ward was born May 19, 1826, and as a teenager, he became sick. He was diagnosed with a debilitating arthritic disease that compromised his physical activity. He had to use crutches much of the time and often could not climb stairs. The disease did not prevent him from hunting, fishing, hiking, or attending schools in Louisville. In 1843, he went to Harvard College and attended for 2 years, but never attained a degree. For a year and a half, from 1849 to 1850, Matt toured England, France, Belgium, Prussia, Austria, and the Middle East. While touring, he described his travels in letters published in the Louisville Journal and in some newspapers in other cities as well. In 1851, his letters were published in book form under the title Letters from Three Continents. He returned home, met and fell in love with Anna Key. The couple got married on May 21, 1853, sometime before the shooting. As was the custom of many newlyweds, they lived in the Ward's mansion with Matt's family. They had a little girl named Emily in 1854 and another little girl in 1858, whom they named Sally. Unfortunately, little Sally only lived to be 8 years old. Their eldest daughter, Emily, had a daughter named Clara Ward, who married John Deere Cady. His mom's dad, his grandfather, was the John Deere. So Clara, Matt and Anna's granddaughter, married the grandson of John Deere. I know that's off topic, but I thought it was a fun and interesting fact. So immediately after the trial, Matt Ward had sought refuge with friends in Indiana and then Henderson, Kentucky, but each time the families were visited by outraged citizens demanding that Ward leave their city. He spent several weeks in New Orleans before returning to Louisville, where his presence was denounced by the Louisville Democrat. Intimidated by the unfavorable notices of his return, Matt left Louisville and returned to New Orleans and Arkansas. He spent several weeks in New Orleans before returning to Louisville, where his presence was denounced by the Louisville Democrat. Intimidated by the unfavorable notices of his return, Matt left Louisville and returned to New Orleans and Arkansas. Matt made one final trip to Louisville, but he had far too many critics there and was never able to reside there again. He spent most of his remaining years at his plantation in Arkansas, raising cotton and working on a book that he never finished about the shooting of Mr. Butler. Even the Civil War did not prompt him to return to Louisville, and he in fact tried to remain uninvolved in the war. On September 30th, 1862, there were some military activities going on around his plantation. Some Southern guerrillas began rounding up Ward's slaves to force them into serving with the Confederacy. Ward rushed out of his house to protest the confiscation. A guerrilla mistook him for an escaped Union officer and fatally shot him in the groin. To thousands of Kentuckians who believed that Butler's life had not been vindicated, this seemed like delayed justice. The second child of Robert and Emily, Sally, was born in Walnut Hall, Kentucky in 1827 at her maternal grandfather's house. She grew up in Louisville and was educated at a French finishing school in Philadelphia. She spoke fluent French and played several musical instruments. She was known as one of the most beautiful Southern belles and was presented to the courts of both England and France. And she's possibly the first girl to ever be called a Southern belle. She wore daring outfits and organized one of the first fancy dress balls in Kentucky. She dazzled her guests by changing dresses several times throughout the night. Many looked up to Sally and would imitate her wardrobe, her style of entertaining, and even the infamous Sally Ward walk. Her many benefit balls for the less fortunate endeared her to the people of Louisville. Her knowledge of horses and riding skill were unmatched, even for someone from Kentucky. While she and a gentleman were riding in Louisville one day, she came upon the market house, which ran for some distance through the center of the street. Instead of going around it, she impulsively dashed through it, without decreasing her speed at all. The man who was riding with her followed her through the market house. He was rewarded by winning the admiration of Sally, but was met with a $25 fine apiece for riding through the market house. When he went the next day, however, to pay the penalty, he found the obligation had already been quietly discharged by Miss Ward herself. In 1848, Sally fell in love with Timothy Bigelow Lawrence, and they were married on December the 5th, 1848. Louisville hotels were packed with guests brought by stagecoach and steamboat. Even the governor and ex-governor attended the wedding. John Crittenden, a lawyer who would later be the biggest help in her brother's trial, was at her wedding. Everyone was dressed in exquisite threads, but everyone's beauty paled in comparison to Sally in her $5,000 wedding gown. There was one person not dressed up. The mother of the groom wore a plain, dark cotton dress trimmed in cotton lace. The couple moved to Boston and lived with Sally's in-laws, Abbott Lawrence and Catherine Bigelow Lawrence. She shocked her in-laws when she appeared at a ball in a dress that resembled bloomers. Remember the conversation Matt and Robert had on the way to kill Mr. Butler, on the way to discuss with Mr. Butler, the girl they saw. This was the outfit that she had on. It resembled bloomers. It was a design by Dr. Amelia Bloomer. It featured loose trousers gathered at the ankles, topped by a short dress or skirt. Sally maintained she wore it in jest, but her in-laws were not amused. Sally absolutely loved wearing makeup. but her husband said it was not acceptable in Boston and she needed to stop painting her face. This was a huge deal to Sally. Her husband stated that before she came to Boston, she had never learned to obey or heed the wishes of others. In correspondence to family and friends back home, Sally expressed her discontentment with her situation, and some of them worried about her health and even her safety. In a letter to her mom regarding the issue of cosmetics, Sally said that she was honoring her husband's request, but she was very unhappy about it. Her mom told her to basically pretend like you're obeying him and then just do as you wish. Use proper caution and he'll never know. She told her daughter that she thought she was more beautiful without the makeup, but if Sally thought differently, she should do what made her happy. She told her to choose one of two things: give it up or stick to it in defiance of all and everything that may oppose. She ended the letter by stating she knew how careless Sally was with her letters and she should burn this one after reading it. 5 days after writing this letter, she wrote to Mrs. Lawrence, Sally's mother-in-law. This is the letter she wrote. Never have I been more surprised, my dear Mrs. Lawrence, than on reading your last letter. I can in no way account for Sally's most objectionable conduct. That she should defy her husband's wishes and commands is so new a trait in Sally's character that I am wholly at a loss to understand it. What the difficulty is, I cannot say, but I think it must have arisen from ill health and consequent depression. It's the first time Sally has been separated from her family, and for myself, she has never been absent for 2 weeks. It's natural she should feel homesick, but surely no reason for the willfulness and obstinacy you speak of. Bigelow I love as my own son, and there's nothing I would not do to make you happy. I've written Sally my wishes and commands upon all subjects relating to herself and your family. I do hope, my dear Miss Lawrence, that you and Mr. Lawrence will endeavor to forget the past, and I think I can safely promise an amendment in Sally for the future. Sally wrote a letter to her mom that was never sent, in which she stated she did not even use powder. In that letter, she doesn't say what her husband did, only that if he acted in such a way again, she would not remain with him another hour. This letter was found by Mr. Lawrence and put into a book he wrote, so he could have left out parts that would incriminate him. We do know an actual letter with similar information was sent to Mrs. Ward because there was a reply to it. Sally's mom told her to really think hard before leaving her husband because she didn't want Sally to regret anything, and she didn't want the reputations of the two families to be ruined. A few days later, Sally's sister wrote to her saying their mother said Sally would be home by fall. Malvina said, you know whatever mother says always takes place. Another letter from her mom followed, telling her that Sally's father would come get her if it wouldn't stir up gossip. Her mother said she never could forgive the Lawrences for the way they had treated her daughter. She told Sally that her pa was drinking constantly, and once again she urged Sally, burn the letters. Sally would send letters begging her parents to come get her because Mr. Lawrence was being intolerable or mean. By the time her dad could get away from business, he'd receive a letter from Sally stating how wonderful Mr. Lawrence was being toward her and that he should disregard the previous letter. In one of the last letters her mom wrote to her, she ended by saying, I never know if my letters reach you. I do not care who reads them. I've always liked to be candid. It seems like she added this part, accepting the fact someone was definitely reading her letters. And they indeed were, because this is all recorded in the short book by Timothy Lawrence and his counsel. On August 17th, Mr. Ward came to Boston and took his daughter back to Kentucky. Mr. Lawrence thought it was just a trip for Sally to visit her family, but Sally would end up staying in Kentucky. Correspondence between Sally's father and husband revealed that her father wanted her to stay in Louisville because Boston's climate was much too hard on her health. Mr. Lawrence said he'd be happy to move to a warmer climate, but he said he had overwhelming reasons for not moving to Louisville. He begged Sally to come back to him, and he would take her anywhere she wished to live, but Sally refused to leave Kentucky. Bigelow announced through newspaper advertisements that his wife had deserted him, and he cautioned people to not trust her or make deals with her on his account. He said he would pay no debt incurred by her. George Prentice of the Louisville Journal came to her defense by stating, "There's not a lady in Kentucky more admired and beloved than Mrs. Lawrence. Kind-hearted, beautiful, fascinating, accomplished, brilliant, and the idol and ornament of the society in which she lived." Her father petitioned for a divorce, and a jury responded that she had been harshly and improperly treated by her husband, and he had slandered her by his advertisement. That fall, the Wards gave Louisville's first fancy dress ball. The Cunningham Band was there. James C. Cunningham was from Bermuda, but had moved to Louisville in 1835. As a dance master and prestigious band leader, he played soirees for Louisville's elite. The day after the Wards' ball, the Louisville Morning Courier described his music as filling 3 large parlors with the most delicious tones. The ball included rare dishes, an abundance of flowers, and the wealthy of society dressed up as characters from the classics. Sally's second husband was a surgeon, Dr. Robert P. Hunt, son of John Wesley Hunt of Lexington, the first millionaire west of the Allegheny Mountains. They were married in October of 1851. Robert and Sally lived on Rampart Street at the corner of Canal Street in New Orleans. The new home was on a scale of magnificence that fully gratified her luxurious tastes and love of the beautiful. Its rich tapestries and Parisian furnishings, its marble court with its glistening fountains and wealth of tropical blooms, formed an exquisite background for her artistic individuality. The dinner parties thrown in this home were legendary. During these parties, the orchestra from the French opera filled the courtyard and dining room with its melodies. Robert and Sally had 3 children in the course of 10 years. Their first son, Robert, lived 10 months. Daughter Emily only lived 3 to 4 months, and she was born in 1854 during the trial of Sally's brothers, Matthew and Robert. Can you imagine the pain of losing 2 babies fairly close together and then having to witness your brothers being put on trial for murder? Finally, in 1857, John Wesley Hunt was born. When the war started in 1861, Sally took John and left Robert because Robert chose to serve with the Confederacy. Robert eventually moved to an apartment in Chicago, either due to PTSD from the experience of war, or due to his wife and child leaving him, or a contribution of both. Robert Hunt had begun to drink quite heavily. He lost his professional status and his place in society because of his addiction. On the night of July the 8th, 1867, a policeman saw the figure of a man lying on the ground. Robert Hunt died from a brain concussion after falling from his second-floor apartment window. Some newspapers stated he fell because he was so intoxicated, but a couple sources stated it was suicide. Either way, it's very sad. After leaving Robert, Sally placed all her focus on raising John. 15 years later, she met Veen Armstrong. Veen P. Armstrong was born in 1824 into a very poor family. His father was a typesetter for the National Intelligencer, but unfortunately he died when Veen was a child and left no means for his wife to provide for their 3 sons. Soon after this loss, she met someone and they were married. She, her husband, and sons moved to Louisville and started a very small grocery store. Much to their astonishment, it grew to be quite prosperous. Eventually, Veen and a couple of friends started a pork farm that ran very successfully throughout the war. In 1876, 2 years after his first wife died, he became the 3rd husband of Mrs. Sally Hunt. It was said about him that he always wore a smile, had a kind word to say, and was a great storyteller. He was very wealthy and was always ready to help those in need. Veen and Sally were married a little over a year when he passed away. He was only 52 when he died, and I couldn't find what he died of, only that he died at the Galt House. Sally and Major George Downs had been seeing each other for 6 years when they decided to get married. They were married in her private parlor at the Galt House in 1885. She was 58 at the time, but it was stated that she was absolutely beautiful and did not look a day over 45. During their marriage, they traveled the world, but always came back home to Louisville. Sally died of a ruptured stomach ulcer on July 8, 1896, at the Galt House Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, and was buried at the Cave Hill Cemetery. Her son, John Wesley Hunt, worked as the night editor of the New York World. In 1911, John Hunt was lost at sea. I find it interesting that Sally died the same day as her second husband, Robert Hunt, 29 years later. So I found that interesting. Malvina Laura Ward. She was the third child of Robert and Emily, and she was born in 1829. Malvina met Colin Shelton Throckmorton, and they got married. The two had 5 children. I'm not sure when he was born, but they had a child named Robert. He died at the age of only 5 months. Their only daughter was Emily Emma Throckmorton, born in 1848, followed by Eris Throckmorton in 1851. In 1856, they had twins, Maurice B. and Matthew Ward. Malvina and Colin moved to Owensboro, Kentucky to raise their family. In 1870, Malvina's oldest living son, Aris, got into an argument with a man by the name of Peyton Kincheloe. Kincheloe waited outside the town on the road he knew Aris would pass. When Aris came through, Kincheloe fired 2 shots with his revolver and killed 19-year-old Aris. Peyton escaped on horseback, and I could not find whether he was ever tried for the murder. I did see in a death report for Aris that Peyton had brothers, and they had murdered some other people as well. I wish I could find more information. Something interesting, the judge in the trial of Matt and Robert had the last name of Kincheloe. I don't know if he was related to these Kincheloes, but it would be interesting to find out. Malvina and Colin's son Maurice graduated from the Agricultural and Mechanical College at Lexington, Kentucky in the year 1874, and in the fall of the same year accepted a position with the Southern Express Company. He moved up rapidly. He remained with them and in 1880 became an agent at Birmingham. In 1882, he became ticket agent for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He was also a member of the Masonic fraternity. On November 16, 1882, Maurice married Miss Florence E. Martin, daughter of Colonel Alberto Martin of Ellington, who was for many years one of the most distinguished citizens of Jefferson County. Maurice resigned from the railroad in December of 1885, moved to Birmingham, and engaged in the insurance and real estate business. He saw an opportunity for increasing his wealth in these fields. Well, it only took a little over a year for real estate values to increase considerably. Due to his risk, he very rapidly became a wealthy and distinguished man, and he and his wife had one of the most beautiful homes in Birmingham. In 1887, he became postmaster. The couple were still very young, and their future appeared to be bright. Unfortunately, the bright future would dim much too soon. In December of 1888, the body of a precious little girl was found in the lake by some teenagers. At first, no one knew who she was, but she was eventually identified as May Hawes, the daughter of Richard and Emma Hawes. The location of her parents and her brother and sister were unknown. Soon her brother Willie was found safe in Atlanta with relatives, but no sign of Emma, Richard, or Irene. It was eventually discovered that Richard was away marrying a new bride. He was found and arrested. Many people believed he was guilty, but some of his co-workers didn't think he could have committed murder. On Saturday, December 8th, 1888, Emma's body was found. His wife's body was found. Rumors spread quickly among the people that Richard might get by with the murder of his wife and daughter. A lynch mob formed, and close to 3,000 people were moving toward the jailhouse. Sheriff Smith had ordered his deputies to fire their shotguns to protect the county jail. One shot was fired, and then shots rang out from everywhere. Many people were injured, and at least 2 people were killed. One of the 2 men killed that day was Maurice Throckmorton, who had reportedly been pleading with the crowd to disperse. Malvina Ward Throckmorton lost her precious son, and Florence Martin lost the love of her life that day. Initially, Sheriff Smith was arrested for Throckmorton's death, but was ultimately found not guilty of murder. The body of the little girl, Irene, was found when the lake was drained, and Richard Hawes was tried, convicted, and hanged for the murder of his precious family, all the while maintaining his innocence. Sadly, his wife and daughters are buried in unmarked graves. Malvina, the 3rd child of Robert and Emily Ward, passed away in 1897 at the age of 65. Robert Jr., the 4th child of Robert and Emily, was born in 1836. He had actually been known as a man of quality character, a man of honor, but I think the killing of Professor Butler muddied that pristine image. Robert was never married and did not have children. Robert died on July 2nd, 1860 at the age of 24, just 6 years after the infamous trial. He went into a cold pond to bathe, was seized with congestive chill, and died. That is what the Tennessean newspaper read. But how cold can a pond be in July? July is the hottest month of the year in Kentucky. I find it interesting that the Louisville Daily Courier read, "The deceased was remarkable for his high sense of honor and those social qualities which endeared him to his associates." Victor Ward. Victor Ward was born in 1839. I was not able to find out much about Victor, as well as Robert Jr. could not find out much about Victor as well. I don't think he was ever married or that he ever had any children. In March of 1859, a story was run in the Clark County Democrat. It said a difficulty occurred on the steamer Victoria yesterday morning between Dr. Cameron of Prentiss, Mississippi, and Victor Ward of Louisville, Kentucky. It also states that Victor is the boy who was whipped by William, but that is incorrect. By William Butler. It was William Ward, not Victor. It goes on to say that Victor pulled out a pistol and fired it at Dr. Cameron. The bullet went into his upper lip, and the doctor immediately left the boat. Victor went on into the city of Memphis and was there for several hours. He returned again on the Victoria, but no effort was made by the authorities to arrest him. A few months after this incident, in June of 1859, at the age of 20, he had been visiting his family in Louisville, and on his way back home to Helena, Arkansas, he died. Most newspapers attributed his death as being caused by a painful illness, but the disease that would eventually be his undoing was alcoholism. William was born in 1839, along with his twin brother Victor. Unfortunately, I could not find much out about William's adult life. The Louisville Daily Journal had this to say about William's death. We have inadvertently neglected to mention the death of William Ward, a young man well known here. He fell victim to consumption on the 3rd of August, 1865 at the White Sulphur Springs, Ohio. He was the last male member of a distinguished family, 3 brothers and the father having died before him. Will Ward was a highly accomplished young man, generous and warm-hearted, and he had many generous and warm-hearted friends. Though his mortal form has sunk into the earth, pleasant thoughts of him will remain. I don't think Noble Butler or any of the Butler family had pleasant thoughts of him, but just saying. Robert and Emily's 7th child, Emily Ward, was born on July 29, 1841. She married William Johnson II in 1857. He was born in 1833 to Dr. James Chew Johnson and Sophia Zane. He was William Johnston II. His grandfather was the first. William and Emily lived in Louisville, and they had 4 children. Nettie Ward Johnson in 1860, Mary J. Ward Johnston in 1867, Lewis Ward Johnston in 1870, and Elma Ward Johnston in 1877. Their first child, Nettie, married Ivy Walker Spicer in 1894. She had one child named Ethel Spicer Hills in 1897. Emily passed away in 1883 at the age of 42 years old. The youngest child of Robert and Emily was Eliza Longworth Ward. They called her Lily. She was born in 1844. Lily met John Schroeder and they were married in 1866 in Warren County, Mississippi at the age of 31 and 22. In 1868, after a couple of years of marriage, they had a little baby girl named Emily Sidell Schroeder. Lily became pregnant once again, and this time it was a precious little baby boy named Harry Flournoy Schroeder. He was born in March of 1872. Unfortunately, Lily would not get to know little Harry because she passed away either during the birth or a few days after the birth. Her obituary says she died from consumption, TB. The little baby ended up dying 15 months later. Lily's obituary said she was a source of cheer and brightness to everyone around her. It's sad that she died at 27 or 28 years old. Her daughter, Emily, lived into her 60s. As far as I could tell, she was never married. Matt's mom, Emily, died in 1874, just a couple of years after her youngest daughter, Lily, died. She was survived by her other 3 daughters. I hope you enjoyed this story. It actually took a lot of research and time to find the pieces, but I really like digging into the history and ancestry of the people in my cases. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week, if not before. If you made it to the end of this video, I hope that means you'll give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. God bless you. Thank you.